So the hymn says, "Blessed One, whether you are born of Kronos, Zeus, or Rhea, I loudly hail thee, Attis. You the Assyrians call thrice desired Adonis. All Egypt calls you Osiris. Samothracians call you Adamos. The Phrygians call you Papus, a corpse, a god, unfruitful, goatherd, green ear of harvested grain, fruitful, almond-born, and player of the pipes." This is a pre-existing hymn to Attis, allegorically read as a reference to Jesus. And he shows you the light of Christ shining through Attis. They are responding to Greek mysteries and integrating the knowledge that they have from the Greek mysteries into their understanding of Christianity, and in effect, seeing the Greek mysteries as equivalent to Jewish prophecies, that is, as symbolically referring to Christ. The Naassenes are a really, to many, really the most fascinating group of all, because they are the most interactive with the data from Greco-Roman culture. And I'm just going to give you a teaser for what you can expect when you read the Naassenes. It is a real head trip, so be prepared. So the Naasene preacher is responsible for a treatise that we have, and we think, or I think I should say, he lives late 2nd century, possibly the early 3rd. He probably led a celibate sect of Christians who claimed to be the only true Christians. And this is really important because, most of the time, they don't self-identify like this, but this guy says not only is he a Christian, but he and his group are the only true Christians, and that's really striking. But what really interests the people about the Naassenes is, again, their engagement, really heavy, vibrant engagement with Greek mystery cults. And more than any other single Christian group, they are responding to Greek mysteries and integrating the knowledge that they have from the Greek mysteries into their understanding of Christianity. And in effect, seeing the Greek mysteries as equivalent to Jewish prophecies, that is, as symbolically referring to Christ and their understanding of Christ. But in the meantime, they bring you through a wild ride for how they come to that conclusion. So just real quick about some of their ethics, their rites, and their thought. There's so much on this, and I have to be really brief here, folks.
Sure.
But we know that they practice a ritual of initiation that is like a Christian baptism, except they called the baptismal water living water. We don't know exactly what they meant by that, but that's what they called it. And they also had, after the baptism, a rite of anointment, and they called their ointment ineffable. So not only would you be baptized, you would be covered with some kind of oil. And possibly, we don't know for sure, but possibly you would be given milk or honey to consume after this ritual. And you would also be asked to commit to celibacy. Now, there's some controversy about this, but I'm pretty sure myself that this group is very much on the celibacy track. And we've talked, what's interesting about the Naassenes is, and one of the reasons that we know they're kind of late in the 2nd century, is that they combine or amalgamate information that they get from other early Christian sects. So the Ophites, who are again on the Patreon, they refer to the god human, and that is a divinized human, actually not divinized, just the true God who is called human with a capital H, and he's always been God, or she's always been God. They insist on androgyny. And also reference to the angelic church. This is something that the Valentinians also made reference to. So there are, in a sense, the Nicene preacher is combining his knowledge of Ophite theology with what we might call Valentinian ecclesiology. And it's these hints that give us the sense that this figure is speaking fairly late in the 2nd century. And that's important because the person who gives us the report, called the Refutator, writer of the Refutation of All Heresies, thinks that the Naassenes are the earliest of all Christian heresies, even earlier than Simon of Samaria. And he thinks that this is the archetypal Christian heresy. And he gets that because he thinks that the heresy comes from Satan or the snake. And the Naassenes are named after the Hebrew word for snake, which is nachash. So that's where, when it's transliterated into Greek, it becomes naas, and then hence you get Naassenes. The Refutator, however, made clear that that's not necessarily what they called themselves. They called themselves the only true Christians, but they also called themselves Gnostics in the sense of knowers. Okay. One of the really striking things about all of this is this radical cosmopolitanism. In other words, whereas a common Christian in the 2nd century and even today would be looking to the Jewish prophecies to get information about Christ and to read everything symbolically or allegorically, what the Nicene preacher does is he turns to other Greco-Roman rites and rituals. But really, his scope is even broader than that. Essentially, he looks at all reality as a simple system of truth and as confirming his own Christian ideology, we might say. And some of the things that he comes up with is pretty amazing. So I'd like to look a little bit more at his allegorical practice, just so you get a sense and a taste of this. So he allegorizes not just Jewish and Christian scripture, but Hellenic cult texts. And as I said, he's able to find Christ, whom he calls typically the child of the human, who inhabits all people. He's able to find this in the cultic descriptions, specifically of the god Attis. Now, Attis is a Phrygian deity who was driven crazy or mad by the goddess Cybele, which led him on his wedding day to cut off his own testicles. And he then bled out underneath a pine tree. This pine tree then signifies his sort of everlasting life, because Attis, although he bleeds out, never really dies. His pinky, it's said, is always twitching. Becomes a very popular deity, both in Roman Asia Minor and in Rome. Now, Attis, as a Greco-Roman god, has hymns that are sung to him. And what the Nicene preacher does is he takes a hymn that was originally sung in honor of Attis, and he gives a theological commentary on it, so that he shows you that it is really Christ who is the subject of the hymn. And I'm just going to give you my translation of this hymn and read it for you, so that you can. So the hymn says, "Blessed one, whether you are born of Kronos, Zeus, or Rhea, I loudly hail thee, Attis. You the Assyrians call thrice desired Adonis. All Egypt calls you Osiris. Samothracians call you Adamos. The Phrygians call you Papus, a corpse, a god, unfruitful, goatherd, green ear of harvested grain, fruitful, almond-born, and player of the pipes." This is a pre-existing hymn to Attis, particular hymn, but it's definitely written by a devotee of Attis, probably lived anywhere from, say, 3rd century BCE to the late 2nd century. We don't know how old the hymn is, but we know it was sung in honor of Attis. You could call it syncretism. I would just call it's a very hybrid concept of deity. I would call it universalizing. I would call it a cosmopolitan universalizing understanding of deity. What this author is trying to do is trying to say that Attis really exists in all religions. And so what the Nicene preacher does is he then goes and says, no, actually, Attis here refers to Christ. Therefore, Christ exists in all religions. Probably the best way for me to give you an example for how the Nicene preacher works is simply to quote a section from the Nicene preacher to give you a sense for how his mind works. And it truly is a beautiful mind, although it does definitely go in all different kinds of directions. So this is a quote that I've translated here from the Refutation. He says, these very Phrygians, that is, the Phrygian worshippers of Attis, say that this same human, referring to Jesus, becomes a god, again, by transformation. He becomes a god when he rises from the dead and through such a gate enters heaven. The Apostle Paul knows this gate since he opened it in a mystery. He said that he was seized by an angel and carried as far as the second and third heaven into paradise and saw what he saw and heard unutterable utterances. Now, if you go back to the actual hymn, you'll see that the passage which the Naassenes preacher is commenting on is this passage which says that the Phrygian Attis is referred to as both a corpse and a god. And when he goes to explain that, he then refers to Christ's resurrection and then his transformation from the resurrection of the dead to become a god. And he says that Paul also experienced this on his trip to the third heaven. Paul was deified on his way to the third heaven. So that's how this author works. He takes a hymn, which is probably pre-Christian, and he essentially he reads it in light of his own revelation from classic biblical texts, what we think of as scriptural texts, and he shows you the light of Christ shining through Attis. Now, there's so much more to this particular sermon. The Naassenes preacher, we usually call his writing a sermon, and most of it survives in the Refutation of All Heresies, most recently translated by me. You can find this on Amazon. But it is a wild ride, and I hope that your viewers leave plenty of comments so that we can get into the nitty-gritty of understanding this most fascinating of all early Christian groups.